Chapter 9: How Asking Questions Increased the Effectiveness of My Sales Interviews. A new idea sometimes produces rapid and revolutionary changes in a man's thinking. For instance, only a short time before I made that sale in New York, I had set a goal for myself to become a $250,000 a year producer. I thought that by hard, consistent work, I could make it. Now, suddenly, I produced $250,000 in one day. Fantastic! How could this be? Only 1 week before, $250,000 a year looked big. Now, here I was thinking $1,000,000 is my goal. Those were some of the thoughts racing through my head that night on the train, riding back to Philadelphia. I was having an emotional jag. I was too excited to stay in my seat. Back and forth I paced through the car. Every seat was occupied, but I don't remember seeing a soul. Over and over again I went through the sale, every word of it, what Mr. Booth said, what I said. Finally, I sat down and wrote out the entire interview. How utterly futile and ridiculous that trip would have been, I said to myself, if I hadn't heard that talk Elliott Hall gave on the importance of asking questions. The truth is, just a few days before, I wouldn't have even considered going to New York on such a case. I realized this: if I had attempted to say exactly the same things without putting them in the form of questions, I'd have been kicked out in 3 minutes flat. Although I said what I had to say with all the force and excitement I possibly could, this successful manufacturer never once showed any resentment. Putting my ideas in the form of questions showed him how I felt about what he should do, but at the same time kept him in the buyer's seat. Each time he offered an objection or comment, I passed the ball right back to him with another question. When he finally got up, took his hat, and said, "Let's go," I know he felt that the idea was his. Only a few days later I obtained a letter of introduction from a friend of mine to the young president of a firm of building engineers who were then erecting several important projects. It was one of the most promising organizations in the city. The young president read my letter of introduction at a glance and said, "If it's insurance you want to talk about, I'm not interested. I just bought more insurance about a month ago." There was something so final in his manner, I felt as though it would be fatal to be persistent. However, I was sincere in wanting to know this man better, so I ventured one question. "Mr. Allen, how did you ever happen to get started in the building construction business?" I listened for 3 hours. Finally his secretary came in with some checks for him to sign. As she left, the young executive looked up at me but said nothing. I looked back at him in silence. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "I want you to answer a few questions," I replied. I left there knowing exactly what was in his mind, his hopes, ambitions, and objectives. Once during the interview he said, "I don't know why I'm telling you all these things. You know more now than I've ever told anybody, even my wife." I believe he discovered things that day he didn't know about himself, things that he had never definitely crystallized in his own mind. I thanked him for his confidence, and I told him I was going to give some thought and study to the information he had given me. 2 weeks later I presented a plan to him and his 2 associates for the perpetuation and protection of their business. It was Christmas Eve. I left that company's office at 4 o'clock that afternoon with signed orders for $100,000 insurance on the life of the president, $100,000 on the vice president, and $25,000 on the secretary-treasurer. That was the beginning of a close personal friendship with these men. During the following 10 years, the business I did with them increased to a total of $750,000. Never once have I felt that I've sold them anything. They've always bought. Instead of trying to give them the impression that I knew all the answers, as was my habit before I heard J. Elliott Hall, I made them give me the answers, largely by asking questions. For a quarter of a century, I found this way of handling people 100 times more effective than trying to win them to my way of thinking. At the time I got this idea from Mr. Hall, I thought he had discovered a new way of thinking. Shortly afterward, I learned another great salesman, right here in Philadelphia, took some time out to write a few things on the subject 150 years before I met Mr. Hall. You may have heard of him. His name was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin told how he dug up this idea from a man who lived in Athens, Greece, 2,200 years before Ben Franklin himself was born. That man's name was Socrates. By his method of questioning, Socrates did something that few men in all history have been able to do. He changed the thinking of the world. I was surprised to learn that as a young man, Franklin couldn't get along with people and made enemies because he argued, made so many positive statements, and tried to dominate people. Finally, he came to realize he was losing out all around. Then he became interested in studying the Socratic method. He took great delight in developing this art and practiced it continually. Franklin wrote, "This habit, I believe, has been a great advantage to me when I have had occasion to persuade men into measures that I have been from time to time engaged in promoting. And as the chief ends of conversation are to inform or to be informed, I wish well-meaning, sensible men would not lessen their power of doing good by a positive, assuming manner that tends to create opposition and to defeat every one of those purposes for which speech was given us." Franklin grew very artful and an expert in drawing people out. But he found the following simple rule most important in preparing the other person for his questions. Franklin continues, "When another asserted something that I thought in error, I denied myself the pleasure of contradicting him abruptly, and of showing immediately some absurdity in his propositions. And in answering, I began by observing that in certain cases or circumstances his opinion would be right, but in the present case there appeared or seemed to me some difference, etc. I soon found the advantage of this change in my manner. The conversation I engaged in went on more pleasantly. The modest way in which I proposed my opinions procured them a readier reception and less contradiction. I had less mortification when I was found to be in the wrong, and I more easily prevailed with others to give up their mistakes and join with me when I happened to be right." This procedure seemed so practical and simple, I began trying it in selling. It helped me immediately. I merely paraphrased Franklin's words the best I could to fit the occasion. I blush when I think of how I used to say, "I can't agree with you there because..." The "don't you think" habit is a little aid which I find helps me avoid making so many positive statements. For example, if I say to you, "We should avoid making so many positive statements. We should ask more questions," I have merely stated my opinion. But if I say to you, "Don't you think we should avoid making so many positive statements? Don't you feel we should ask more questions?" Haven't I shown you how I feel? But haven't I, at the same time, made you happier by asking your opinion? Isn't your listener likely to have 10 times as much enthusiasm if he thinks the idea is his? You can do two things with a question. One, let the other person know what you think. And two, you can at the same time pay him the compliment of asking his opinion. A famous educator once said to me, "One of the biggest things you get out of a college education is a questioning attitude, a habit of demanding and weighing evidence, a scientific approach." Well, I never had the advantage of going to college, but I know one of the best ways to get men to think is to ask them questions, pertinent questions. In fact, I have found in many cases it is the only way to get them to think. 6 things you can gain by the question method. 1. It helps you avoid arguments. 2. It helps you avoid talking too much. 3. It enables you to help the other fellow recognize what he wants. Then you can help him decide how to get it. 4. Helps crystallize the other person's thinking. The idea becomes his idea. 5. Helps you find the most vulnerable point with which to close the sale, the key issue. 6. Gives the other person a feeling of importance. When you show that you respect his opinion, he is more likely to respect yours. One of the biggest things you get out of a college education is a questioning attitude, a habit of demanding and weighing evidence, a scientific approach.